In the stillness of the evening, Harold Ellison stared at the letter in his trembling hands. The den where he'd spent countless nights, fixing broken toys for grandchildren, paying bills, reading with Eleanor by his side, suddenly felt like a stranger's room. Golden light spilled across the mahogany desk, highlighting the ink that now blurred beneath his tears. 42 years of marriage. That's what the calendar on the wall represented. 42 years of shared breakfasts, weathered storms, whispered dreams, and now, this single piece of paper threatened to unravel everything. Has betrayal ever turned your world upside down? Share your experience below, like if this resonates with your heart, and follow to witness one man's journey from devastation to dignity. The first tear fell silently, landing on the corner of the page. Harold's throat tightened, a lifetime of certainty crumbling like autumn leaves. The familiar tick of the grandfather clock seemed to mock him now, counting moments in a future suddenly emptied of its promise. "Not possible," he whispered, the words catching on a sob. Outside, a car door closed. Eleanor returning from her doctor's appointment. The appointment that had started this terrible unraveling. Harold slipped the letter into his desk drawer, wiping his eyes with the back of his weathered hand. The truth wouldn't stay hidden for long, but for now, he needed a moment to catch his breath before facing the woman who, after 4 decades, had become a stranger. 40 years of marriage had taught Harold to notice the little things. The way Eleanor's eyes crinkled when she laughed, the gentle click of her wedding ring against the countertop as she prepared dinner. The subtle changes in routine that meant something wasn't right. And now, sitting in his den with the evening sun casting long shadows across the hardwood floor, it was something small that caught his eye. The calendar. Harold leaned forward in his worn leather chair, the familiar creak accompanying his movement. He reached for the desk calendar where Eleanor had circled the doctor's appointment in red, then written, "Baby," in her flowing script. His weathered fingers traced the date, then moved to the travel itinerary beside it. The coffee he'd been nursing grew cold as his brow furrowed. "Can't be right," he murmured, his voice oddly loud in the quiet room. He was in Chicago that week, the whole week, the medical conference he'd attended every year for the past decade. The dates didn't line up. Harold's hand trembled slightly as he opened the drawer and pulled out the ultrasound image. Just yesterday, they'd sat together on the couch while Eleanor explained what the doctor had said about the baby's development. How she was exactly 8 weeks along. He'd been so thrilled at the prospect of becoming a father again. At 62, a miracle he hadn't dared hope for. The first tear fell silently, landing on the corner of the ultrasound. His mind raced back to the dinner 3 weeks ago, Theodora and Silas joining them to celebrate Eleanor's birthday. The way Silas had seemed unusually quiet. The way Eleanor had avoided his eyes when mentioning Theodora's sudden family emergency during their girls' trip. The clock on the mantel ticked loudly, each second hammering the growing suspicion in his chest. Harold pressed a hand to his heart, feeling it pound beneath his palm. He'd fixed cars all his life, finding the problem when everything looked fine on the surface, finding what others missed. "Not my Eleanor," he whispered, voice cracking. "Not after all these years." But the evidence sat before him, cold and unforgiving as winter in Michigan. The dates, the timing. The math didn't add up. Another tear joined the first as he bowed his head. The photo of their vow renewal on their 30th anniversary watched him from the bookshelf, younger versions of themselves promising forever. In the kitchen hung pictures of Eleanor's daughters from her first marriage, women who'd accepted him as a father figure, who'd given him grandchildren to bounce on his knee in this very room. Harold wiped his eyes with the back of his hand, then noticed something he'd missed. A smudge on the ultrasound form where the conception date estimate had been written, almost as if someone had erased and rewritten a number. The old mechanic in him, the man who could diagnose an engine problem from the slightest unusual sound, knew something wasn't adding up. The sudden knock at the den door made him straighten, quickly slipping the calendar and ultrasound into the drawer. "Harold, you in there?" Eleanor's voice called from the hallway. He cleared his throat, willing his voice to steady. "Be right out." Harold's legs felt heavy as he pushed himself up from his chair. For a moment, he steadied himself against the desk, not trusting his balance. 40 years of marriage, and he'd never once doubted Eleanor, not once. "Coming, darlin'," he called, fighting to keep his voice casual. He opened the door to find Eleanor standing there, grocery bags in hand, her face bright with the glow folks always talked about with expectant mothers. The sight twisted in his chest like a wrench on a stubborn bolt. "Thought you might want to help put these away," she said, leaning in for a quick kiss. "Got those peanut butter cookies you like?" Harold forced a smile. "Sounds good." In the kitchen, he moved mechanically, placing cans in the pantry while his mind raced. Eleanor chatted about running into Theodora at the store, how she'd seemed distant, probably still upset about cutting her trip short for that family emergency. "Everything all right with you?" Eleanor asked suddenly. "You're awful quiet tonight." "Just tired is all." The lie felt foreign on his tongue. "Been thinking about those dates for the doctor's appointments." Eleanor's hand paused briefly as she reached for the refrigerator door. So brief most folks would miss it. But Harold had spent a lifetime noticing the small hesitations that meant something wasn't right under the hood. "What about them?" she asked. "Just making sure I'm here for the important ones." He kept his voice steady. "When exactly did the doctor say you were due again?" "February 10th, she answered, turning away to arrange yogurt containers. "Remember? We figured it'll be our Valentine's baby." Harold nodded, doing the math again in his head. 8 weeks along now, conception late May or early June, during his Chicago trip. "Think I'll give Silas a call," he said casually. "See if he wants to grab coffee tomorrow. Been a while since we talked, just us old fellas." The yogurt container slipped from Eleanor's hand, landing with a soft thud on the counter. "Oh, he's been busy with work. Theodora mentioned he's been pulling late hours." "I'll try anyway." Harold reached for the phone, watching her reflection in the kitchen window. "How's Theodora doing since that emergency during your girls' weekend?" Eleanor's shoulders tensed. "Better now." Her mother's health scare turned out to be nothing serious. That night, lying beside Eleanor in bed, Harold stared at the ceiling. Sleep evaded him like a stubborn engine problem with no clear solution. Beside him, Eleanor's breathing wasn't the deep rhythm of sleep either. In the morning, he waited until she left for her yoga class before retrieving the hidden calendar from his den. With hands that had rebuilt countless engines but now couldn't stop their slight tremor, he dialed Theodora's number. "Harold?" Her voice sounded surprised. "Is everything okay?" "Not sure," he answered truthfully. "I need to ask you something about that girl's trip with Eleanor." A long pause filled the line. "What about it?" Harold closed his eyes, steeling himself. "When exactly did you leave, because of your mother's emergency?" The silence that followed told him everything he needed to know. The silence stretched between them like a frayed wire, dangerous and telling. "Harold," Theodora finally said, her voice unnaturally controlled. "Why don't we meet for coffee instead? Some things shouldn't be discussed over the phone." "The Bluebird Cafe, 1 hour." Harold hung up, his hand trembling slightly as he set the receiver down. He moved to his workbench in the garage, the space that had been his sanctuary for decades. Surrounded by the familiar scent of motor oil and metal, he tried to steady himself. Old tools hung in perfect order on the pegboard, tools that had helped him solve countless mechanical problems throughout his life. But they couldn't fix this. The wooden stool creaked beneath him as he pulled out the ultrasound photo again. His eyes traced the grainy image, their miracle baby. Eleanor had been overjoyed, saying God had blessed them with one more chance at raising a child together after her daughters were grown. They'd stayed up late that night, talking about names, planning the nursery. "Damn it," he whispered, the curse sounding hollow in the empty garage. His reflection caught in the small mirror above the sink, lines etched deeper around his eyes than they'd been yesterday. An old man being made a fool. The thought stung worse than any physical pain he'd endured. Harold arrived at the Bluebird 15 minutes early, choosing a corner booth away from the morning regulars who might recognize him. The coffee arrived black and scalding, just as he preferred it, but he couldn't bring himself to take a sip. When Theodora walked in, her usual confident stride was missing. She slid into the booth across from him, her wedding ring clinking against the laminate tabletop as she folded her hands. "I left 2 days into the trip," she said without preamble, her voice low. "There was no emergency with my mother." Harold nodded, something cold settling in his chest. "And Silas?" "Told me he was going fishing with his brother." Her eyes met his, sharing a grief that connected them in a way he'd never wanted. "He wasn't." "Eleanor told me she was with you the whole time." Theodora looked down at her untouched water. "I'm sorry, Harold." He pulled out the calendar, pointing to the dates. "The baby." "I suspected something," she admitted. "The way they acted at Eleanor's birthday dinner. Little glances." "I just didn't want to believe it." A waitress approached, but retreated quickly at Harold's expression. Outside the cafe window, an elderly couple walked hand in hand down the sidewalk, and the sight sent a sharp pain through his chest. "What are you going to do?" Theodora asked. The question hung between them as Harold stared at the calendar. 40 years of marriage. Retirement plans for traveling the country in the RV they'd purchased last summer. A nursery they'd started painting last weekend, soft yellow, because they wanted to be surprised by the baby's gender. All built on a lie. "I'm going to hear it from her," he said finally, his voice steady despite the storm inside him. "Tonight." As he stood to leave, Theodora reached across the table, briefly touching his hand. No words passed between them, just the silent understanding of shared betrayal. Outside, Harold squinted in the bright morning sunlight. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Eleanor, sending a text about picking up more nursery paint. His finger hovered over the screen, unsure how to respond to the woman he'd thought he knew better than anyone in the world. The house was quiet when Harold returned. He placed his keys in the ceramic dish Eleanor had made in that pottery class 5 years back. Her touches were everywhere. The framed cross-stitch in the hallway, the collection of antique teacups in the dining room cabinet, the quilt draped over his recliner. 40 years of shared life surrounded him. Harold moved through the rooms with deliberate steps, feeling like a stranger in his own home. The nursery door stood ajar, yellow paint gleaming in the afternoon light. A stuffed bear, their first purchase for the baby, sat in the white rocking chair. His throat tightened. "Harold? Is that you?" Eleanor called from the kitchen. "I got that paint we wanted for the trim. The nice lady at the hardware store said it'll dry faster than the other kind." He found her at the kitchen table, paint samples spread before her, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up with a smile that had welcomed him home for 4 decades. "Theodora called," Eleanor said, removing her glasses. "Said you two had coffee. Everything okay?" The moment had arrived. Harold lowered himself into the chair across from her, placing the calendar and ultrasound photo on the table between them like evidence at a trial. "No," he said simply. "Everything is not okay." Eleanor's smile faltered. "What's wrong?" "The baby." His voice remained steady, though his heart hammered against his ribs. "It's not mine, is it?" The color drained from Eleanor's face. For a moment, she looked like she might deny it, might fabricate some explanation. Then her shoulders sagged, defeat washing over her features. "Harold," she whispered. "Just tell me the truth," he said. "All of it." "I deserve that much." Tears welled in her eyes. "It was just one night, one stupid mistake." "With Silas." It wasn't a question. She nodded, a tear tracking down her cheek. Theodora had left because of a fight they'd had. We'd all been drinking. He was upset I was trying to comfort him. Comfort. The word tasted bitter. That what folks call it these days? It meant nothing, she pleaded, reaching for his hand across the table. He pulled back. A terrible mistake. When I found out about the baby, I was horrified. I knew it couldn't be yours, but I hoped, I prayed it somehow was. Harold stood, moving to the window. Outside, the garden they'd tended together bloomed with summer flowers. The bird bath he'd installed for her 60th birthday stood in the center, surrounded by the rose bushes they'd planted to mark each decade of marriage. "Does Silas know?" he asked, still facing the window. "Yes," she admitted. "I told him last week." "And?" He said it's my problem, that Theodora can never know." Harold turned, meeting her tear-filled eyes. "Well, she does now." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, a sob escaping. "Oh, God." 40 years, Harold said, his voice finally breaking. 4 decades, Eleanor. We've weathered job losses, your cancer scare, my heart attack, your daughter's divorces. We survived it all together. And you throw it away for one night with my friend's husband? "Please," she begged, rising from her chair. "We can work through this. I love you. It was a horrible mistake, but this baby, we can still raise it together. Be a family." The words hung in the air between them like smoke. Harold looked at the woman he'd devoted his life to, searching for the Eleanor he knew. Instead, he saw a stranger wearing his wife's face. "I can't do that," he said finally. "I won't raise Silas's child and pretend it's mine. Harold, please. I'll be staying at Mike's place tonight. I need time to think." As he turned to leave, Eleanor collapsed back into her chair, sobs racking her body. The sound followed him down the hallway, up the stairs, into their bedroom, where he mechanically packed an overnight bag. Once, such a sound would have had him rushing to comfort her. Now each sob felt like an accusation of his own failure, to be enough, to see the truth, to protect what he'd thought was unbreakable. In the car, his hands gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles whitened. Only then did he allow his own tears to fall. Mike's guest room was sparsely furnished, a bed, a nightstand, and a chair by the window. Harold sat on the edge of the mattress, staring at his phone. 27 missed calls from Eleanor. 13 text messages he couldn't bring himself to read. "Coffee's ready," Mike called from the hallway. "Strong and black, just how you like it." Harold had known Mike Thompson since high school. They'd worked side by side at the auto shop for 30 years before retirement. If anyone understood him, it was Mike. "Thanks for letting me stay," Harold said, accepting the steaming mug. Mike settled into the chair across from him. "You want to talk about it?" The whole story spilled out. The calendar discrepancy, Theodora's confirmation, Eleanor's confession. Mike listened without interruption, his weathered face growing grimmer with each detail. "Jesus, Harold, after 40 years. 42 next month." Harold's laugh held no humor. "We were planning a cruise for our anniversary. What will you do about, you know?" Mike gestured vaguely. "The baby." The question hit like a physical blow. Harold had always wanted a biological child. Eleanor's daughters from her first marriage were wonderful. He loved them like his own. But there had always been that quiet longing. When Eleanor told him she was pregnant, it had seemed like a miracle at their age, a gift. Now that gift was revealed as the ultimate betrayal. "I can't raise another man's child," Harold said, the words feeling both resolute and hollow. "Especially not his. Have you called the girls yet? Told them what their mother did?" Harold shook his head. "Don't know what to say. Your mother's pregnant by my friend's husband's isn't exactly easy to work into conversation." By afternoon, Harold's phone buzzed with a text from Theodora. "Silas moved out this morning. Coffee tomorrow." They met at a different cafe this time, away from their usual haunts. Theodora looked like she hadn't slept, her normally perfect appearance showing cracks, smudged mascara, unironed blouse. "He didn't even deny it," she said, stirring her untouched coffee. "Just packed a bag and left." 38 years of marriage, and he walked out like it was nothing. Harold nodded, understanding the particular sting of that wound. "Eleanor keeps calling," he admitted. "Says she'll do anything to fix this." "Can it be fixed?" Theodora asked, meeting his eyes. The question followed Harold through the day, echoing as he drove aimlessly through town. He passed the retirement community they'd toured last year, planning ahead for when the house became too much to maintain. The elementary school, where they'd volunteered as crossing guards. The park bench, where he'd proposed 4 decades ago. Everywhere, memories ambushed him. By evening, he found himself parked outside their house. The porch light was on, Eleanor's signal since the early days of their marriage that she was waiting for him to come home. Inside, he found her at the kitchen table, surrounded by photo albums. Her eyes were swollen from crying, her hair uncombed. "You came back," she whispered, hope threading through her voice. "Just to talk," he clarified, remaining standing. "Harold, please." She stood, approaching him with outstretched hands. He stepped back. "We can get through this. Couples survive affairs all the time. This isn't just an affair, Eleanor. You're carrying his child. I could... There are options." Her voice broke. "If that's what it takes to save us." Harold stared at her, momentarily speechless. "You'd terminate the pregnancy? After all those years we tried for a baby together?" "I don't want to lose you." Tears spilled down her cheeks. 40 years, Harold. That has to count for something." "It counted for something to me," he said quietly. "Why didn't it count for you when you were with Silas?" She had no answer for that. Harold moved to the living room, looking at the life they'd built together. The wedding portrait above the fireplace. The collection of souvenir spoons from their travels. The recliner worn to the shape of his body after countless evenings spent reading beside her. All of it now shadowed by betrayal. "I think we need to talk about separation," he said finally. Eleanor sank onto the couch, her face crumpling. "Please don't do this. We can go to counseling. Work through it together." "I need time, Eleanor. Space to think." "Where will you go?" "Mike offered his guest room until I figure things out." He moved toward the door, unable to bear the sight of her tears any longer. "I'll call about picking up more of my things." Outside, the evening air felt thick with unspoken words. Harold sat in his car, unable to start the engine, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what was happening. For the first time in his adult life, he had no home to return to, no comfortable routine, no partner waiting at the end of each day. In the empty parking lot of a closed grocery store, Harold finally allowed himself to break down. Sobs tore from his chest, decades of certainty crashing down around him. The future he'd planned, growing old together, watching grandchildren play in their yard, holding Eleanor's hand until the very end, evaporated like morning dew. When the tears finally subsided, Harold found himself staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. The man looking back seemed older, wearier, but somehow still standing, still breathing, still here. Has betrayal ever left you standing in the ruins of what you thought was unshakable? Share your experience below, like if this resonates with your heart, and follow to see how our protagonist finds the strength to rebuild when everything familiar has crumbled. Can dignity rise from such complete devastation? 3 weeks in Mike's guest room had given Harold plenty of time to think. The small space had become a sanctuary of sorts, neutral territory where he could sort through the wreckage of his life without Eleanor's tearful pleas or the house's accusing memories. He'd established a simple routine: coffee at dawn, walks through the neighborhood, occasional meals with Mike when the silence grew too heavy. The girls, Melissa and Jennifer, had called after Eleanor finally told them. Their concern warmed him, their anger on his behalf a balm to his wounded pride. "You don't have to decide anything right now, Dad," Melissa had said, the dad title he'd earned over decades meaning more than ever. "Take your time." But time was passing. Eleanor's texts had evolved from desperate pleas to practical questions about bills and the house. Theodora called every few days, her own pain a mirror to his. Silas had apparently moved in with a cousin in Toledo, refusing to discuss the pregnancy. Today, Harold had an appointment he'd been dreading. Martin Greenberg had been his attorney for 30 years, handling everything from house closings to his will. The small law office smelled of leather-bound books and coffee, a comforting consistency in his upended world. "Divorce at your age," Martin said, after Harold explained the situation. "I won't lie to you, Harold. It's complicated. Assets accumulated over 40 years, retirement accounts, the house." "I don't want to leave her destitute," Harold interrupted. "I just want out." Martin nodded, making notes. "And regarding the child?" The question still felt like a knife twist. "It's not mine. Legally, if born during the marriage, there's a presumption." "It's not mine," Harold repeated firmly. "I want that clear in any paperwork." Afterward, he sat in his car, Martin's folder of legal options heavy on the passenger seat. Divorce. The word itself felt foreign. Harold Ellison, divorcing after 40 years of marriage. The thought would have been inconceivable 2 months ago. His phone rang. Eleanor. After a moment's hesitation, he answered. "The doctor's appointment is tomorrow," she said, without preamble. "Theodora's coming with me." Harold's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Theodora?" "She called me last week, said we should talk." Eleanor's voice sounded different, less desperate, more resigned. "She's been surprisingly kind, considering." "That's good," Harold said, unsure how else to respond. "Harold, She paused. "I've been thinking about what happens next, after the baby comes. And? I can't terminate. I just can't. But I understand why you can't stay." The words seemed to cost her. "I've spoken with a real estate agent about listing the house." The statement hit him with unexpected force. Their house, the one they'd bought as newlyweds, where they'd raised her girls, hosted countless Christmases and Thanksgivings. The home they'd lovingly renovated, room by room over decades. You don't have to move," he found himself saying. "I can't afford it alone," she said simply. "And too many memories." After the call ended, Harold drove to the park where they'd walked together every Sunday for years. The familiar path along the lake offered no answers, but the rhythm of walking helped clear his mind. What did he want? The question had haunted him for weeks. He couldn't forgive the betrayal. The pregnancy made that impossible, a constant, growing reminder of Eleanor's infidelity with his friend. Even if he could somehow move past it, the child would always be Silas's. Every milestone, every feature, every birthday would reopen the wound. Yet the thought of divorce, of legally severing 4 decades of shared life, felt like amputating a limb. Who was Harold Ellison without Eleanor? The question terrified him. A young couple passed him on the path, pushing a stroller, their matching wedding bands catching the afternoon sun. Once, that had been him and Eleanor, walking these same paths with Melissa and Jennifer, planning their future together. By sunset, Harold found himself outside their house. No, her house now. The porch light was on. Some habits died hard. Eleanor opened the door before he could knock, surprise written across her face. "Harold?" "Thought we should talk in person," he said, "about the house, the divorce, everything." She led him inside, the familiar scent of home hitting him with unexpected force. The kitchen table was covered with papers, real estate listings, bank statements, medical forms. The sight struck him. Eleanor had always been the practical one, handling life's details, while he fixed things with his hands. "I've been working through the finances," she said, gesturing to the papers. "The house should sell quickly in this market. After the mortgage is paid off, we can split what's left." Harold nodded, studying her. The pregnancy was showing now, a small but unmistakable curve beneath her sweater. He looked away. "I met with Martin today," he said, "about divorce options." Eleanor flinched slightly at the word, but nodded. "That makes sense." "This isn't how I thought we'd end," Harold said quietly. "Me neither." Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I'm so sorry, Harold. Not just for what happened, but for trying to hide it, for letting you think the baby was yours. That wasn't fair." The simple admission, devoid of excuses or desperate pleas, touched something in him. It was the first time her apology hadn't felt like emotional manipulation. "What will you do?" he asked. "After the baby comes?" "Melissa offered her guest house until I figure things out." A small, sad smile. "Turns out our daughters have more forgiveness in them than either of us expected." They talked into the evening, practical matters mostly, the dismantling of their shared life reduced to assets and liabilities. Who would take which furniture, how to divide the holiday decorations, what to do with the wedding album neither of them wanted but couldn't bear to throw away. As he prepared to leave, Harold paused in the hallway, looking at the photographs that chronicled their life together. "I need to ask you something, and I need the truth." Eleanor nodded, waiting. Was this the only time? In 40 years, was Silas the only one? "Yes," she said without hesitation, holding his gaze. "The only time. I know that doesn't make it better, but it's the truth." Harold believed her, and somehow that made his decision both harder and clearer. "I'll have Martin draw up the papers," he said. "I think it's best if we make this official." A clean break. Outside, in the driveway where he'd parked countless times, Harold felt an unexpected sense of calm. The decision was made. The path forward, though painful, was clear. For the first time since discovering the calendar discrepancy, he felt like he could breathe again. Not healed, not yet, but no longer drowning. The law office felt too warm, despite the October chill outside. Harold loosened his tie slightly, aware of the small beads of sweat forming at his temples. He'd worn a suit, the charcoal gray one Eleanor had helped him pick for their nephew's wedding last year. A strange choice for signing divorce papers, perhaps, but it felt important to mark the occasion with some dignity. Martin arranged the documents in a neat fan across the polished conference table. "I've highlighted where you need to sign," he explained. "Take your time to review everything first." Harold nodded, scanning the pages that reduced 42 years to legal terminology. Division of assets, dissolution of marriage. His life with Eleanor distilled to paragraphs and subclauses. The door opened, and Eleanor entered with her attorney, a younger woman named Patricia, whom Harold had met once during negotiations. Eleanor wore a navy dress that accommodated her now visible pregnancy, her hair freshly styled, her expression carefully composed. Their eyes met briefly before she took a seat across the table. "Mrs. Ellison, Mr. Ellison," Martin began formally. "We're here today to finalize the dissolution of your marriage. The terms have been agreed upon by both parties." Harold barely heard the legal details that followed. The house would be sold, proceeds split equally, retirement accounts divided, personal possessions already separated during Harold's move to his new apartment 2 weeks ago. The prenatal paternity test had confirmed what they already knew. The child was Silas's, and the divorce decree explicitly stated Harold had no parental rights or obligations. When the time came to sign, Harold's hand trembled slightly. Beside the line marked with a yellow tab, he would end the promise he'd made 42 years ago. For better or worse, in sickness and in health, till death do us part. Death hadn't parted them. Betrayal had. He signed his name, the pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. Eleanor's turn came next. A tear escaped despite her composure, tracking silently down her cheek as she signed. Harold found himself reaching across the table, offering his handkerchief, a gesture from decades of shared life. "Thank you," she whispered, accepting it. After the final signatures were complete, Martin and Patricia stepped out, ostensibly to make copies, but clearly giving them a moment alone. "So that's it," Eleanor said softly. "That's it." Harold nodded, the finality settling over him like a weight. "I never thought—" She stopped, composing herself. "I'm sorry it ended this way, Harold. Truly sorry." "Me too." An uncomfortable silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken words. Through the window, Harold could see the courthouse square where they'd once fed pigeons on Sunday afternoons after church, where he'd pushed the girls on the swings, where they'd watched 4th of July fireworks from the same bench year after year. "What will you do now?" Eleanor asked. "Focus on the apartment. Make it livable." He shrugged. "Mike's been talking about a fishing trip to Michigan next month." "That sounds nice." Her hand rested briefly on her stomach, the gesture unconscious. "Melissa has been helping me pack. The house goes on the market next week." Harold nodded, unsure what to say. The practical details were easier than acknowledging the chasm between them. "Theodora called yesterday," Eleanor continued. "Silas finally agreed to meet with her attorney. Looks like their divorce will be final soon, too." "How is she doing?" "Better, I think. She's talking about moving to Arizona to be near her sister. A small, sad smile. We've become unlikely friends through all this. Who would have thought? The attorneys returned with copies of the signed documents, breaking the moment. Handshakes were exchanged, brief pleasantries offered, and then it was over. 42 years of marriage dissolved in a 30-minute appointment. In the hallway outside, Harold found himself walking beside Eleanor toward the elevator. "Do you need a ride?" he asked automatically, then remembered. "Sorry, old habit." "It's okay. Melissa's waiting downstairs." Eleanor turned to face him fully. "Harold, I know this changes nothing, but I want you to know how sorry I am, not just for what I did, but for who I hurt." "You deserved better." The simple sincerity in her voice touched something in him. Not forgiveness. He wasn't there yet, might never be, but perhaps the first hint of acceptance. "Take care of yourself, Eleanor," he said softly. "You too, Harold." The elevator arrived, its cheerful ding incongruous with the moment. They rode down in silence, standing farther apart than they ever had in 4 decades together. In the courthouse lobby, Melissa waited, immediately moving to her mother's side with protective concern. She offered Harold a small, sad smile and a quick hug. "You okay, Dad?" she whispered. The title still warmed him. "I will be." As he watched Eleanor and Melissa leave, Harold felt a curious mixture of grief and relief. The door to his past had firmly closed. Whatever came next, the uncertainty, the loneliness, the rebuilding, it was his path alone to walk. Outside, the October air felt crisp and clean. Harold took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and headed toward his car. One chapter ended, another beginning. Standing up for your dignity is never easy, especially after decades together. Comment with your story of choosing self-respect, like for support, and follow to see our protagonist embrace his new chapter. Will his courage bring peace or regret? 6 weeks after signing the divorce papers, Harold stood in the driveway of what had once been his home. A sold sticker had been slapped across the "For Sale" sign just yesterday. 28 days on the market, faster than anyone had expected in the November real estate slump. The new owners would take possession after the new year. A young couple with 2 small children and another on the way. They'd fallen in love with the backyard maple tree and the built-in bookshelves Harold had crafted in the living room. At least, that's what Eleanor had told him when she called with the news. Today was for final closure, retrieving the last of his belongings from the garage and shed. Items they'd agreed could wait until after the sale was finalized. Eleanor had suggested he come while she was at her doctor's appointment to avoid any awkwardness. The garage door groaned on its tracks. He'd always meant to oil those hinges. Inside, cardboard boxes labeled Harold in Eleanor's neat handwriting were stacked against the wall. His tools had already been moved to his apartment, but these boxes contained the miscellany of a life. Fishing gear, books, old records, the model car collection he'd started in his 30s. Working methodically, Harold loaded the boxes into his truck. The physical labor felt good, simple, straightforward, uncomplicated by emotion. When he reached the box labeled Photos Memorabilia, he hesitated briefly before adding it to the pile. The shed was next. Garden tools he no longer needed but couldn't bear to part with. The wooden sled he'd restored for Jennifer's children. Christmas decorations Eleanor had insisted were more his than hers. The hand-carved nativity set from his grandfather, the collection of vintage glass ornaments. As he sorted through the items, Harold realized how much of himself remained embedded in this property. 40 years of projects, repairs, and improvements surrounded him. the raised garden beds he'd built when Eleanor developed a passion for heirloom tomatoes, the stone path he'd laid one summer weekend, the shed itself, constructed with Mike's help after a tornado demolished the original. "I thought I might find you out here." Harold turned to see Theodora standing at the shed entrance, wrapped in a camel-colored coat against the November chill. "Eleanor said you'd be by today," she explained. "I was dropping off some things for her and thought I'd say hello." Harold nodded, gesturing to the pile of garden tools. "Just clearing out the last of it. It's strange, isn't it? Dismantling a life piece by piece." Theodora's voice held the understanding of someone walking the same difficult path. "How have you been?" Harold asked, setting down the hedge trimmers he'd been holding. "Managing. The house closes next week." She offered a small smile. "Condo in Scottsdale is waiting. My sister's already planning our hikes and spa days. Arizona sounds nice, especially in January. You should visit sometime. The guest room has a view of the mountains." The offer surprised him, a friendship separate from their shared past with Eleanor and Silas. Before he could respond, Theodora continued, "Have you heard about Silas?" Harold shook his head. "He's moved to Florida, some fishing village on the Gulf." She leaned against the doorframe, refusing to discuss child support or any responsibility for the baby. "My attorney's handling it." "I'm sorry." "Don't be." In a strange way, this whole awful mess has been clarifying. She looked around the shed, at the remnants of Harold's life with Eleanor. We spend decades with people we think we know completely, then discover we never really knew them at all. The observation struck Harold with its accuracy. Had he ever truly known Eleanor? Or had he known only the parts of herself she'd chosen to share? The thought was both disturbing and oddly liberating. They worked together for the next hour, loading the remaining items into Harold's truck. The simple camaraderie felt comfortable. Two people united by parallel losses, asking nothing of each other beyond the moment's task. "Eleanor told me you've been helping her," Harold said, as they closed the truck's tailgate. "That was generous of you." Theodora shrugged. "Turns out anger is exhausting to maintain, and she's been just as supportive during my rough patches." She paused. "The baby's a girl, by the way. Due in February." The information landed oddly in Harold's chest, not the sharp pain he'd expected, but a dull ache of what might have been a daughter. The child he'd briefly believed was his. "She's thinking of moving to Cincinnati after the birth," Theodora continued. "Her sister lives there. Fresh start." Harold nodded, unable to formulate a response that felt adequate. "Will you see her before she goes?" Theodora asked. "I don't know." The truth was, he'd been avoiding any contact beyond what was absolutely necessary. The divorce was final, the house sold. There was no practical reason for them to meet again. As if reading his thoughts, Theodora said gently, "Sometimes closure needs more than signatures on legal documents." After she left, Harold stood in the driveway, looking at the house that had been his home for 4 decades. The maple tree he'd planted when they first moved in now towered over the roof. The porch swing, where they'd spent countless summer evenings, still hung from chains he'd installed. The bedroom window where he'd once caught Eleanor dancing alone to the radio. A moment of such simple joy he'd stood watching for minutes before joining her. Before he could reconsider, Harold pulled out his phone and texted Eleanor. "Finished at the house. Would you like to meet for coffee someday next week?" Her response came quickly. "I'd like that. Wednesday at the Bluebird." "See you then," he replied. The Bluebird Cafe was neutral territory, not their favorite restaurant, not a place loaded with significant memories. When Harold arrived Wednesday afternoon, Eleanor was already there, seated in a corner booth away from the windows. She looked different somehow. Her hair was shorter, her clothing style changed subtly. The pregnancy was prominently visible now, impossible to ignore. "Thank you for suggesting this," she said after he'd ordered coffee. "I've wanted to talk to you, but I wasn't sure you'd want to see me." "Wasn't sure myself," Harold admitted. "But it felt unfinished." Eleanor nodded, understanding. 42 years is a lot to leave dangling. They talked about practical matters first, the house closing, the final division of assets, her plans to move to Cincinnati. The safe topics that required no emotional excavation. "How's the apartment?" she asked eventually. "Coming along. Feels like home now." It wasn't entirely true, but it was becoming truer each day. "Mike's daughter helped me pick out some furniture. Turns out I have terrible taste on my own." Eleanor smiled at that. "You always did. Remember that orange recliner you wanted when we first got married?" "It was comfortable," he protested, finding himself smiling back despite everything. The moment of shared history hung between them, not just the pain of recent months, but the decades of life before the betrayal. The good years, the happy memories that had been temporarily eclipsed by the final chapter of their marriage. "Harold," Eleanor said, her voice growing serious, "I know I've said it before, but I am truly sorry. For all of it. You deserved better." He nodded, studying his coffee cup. "I know you are. I don't expect forgiveness. I just—" She paused, collecting herself. "I hope someday you can think of our life together and remember some good along with the bad." Harold looked at the woman across from him, not his wife anymore, but still the person who'd shared his life longer than anyone else on earth. The mother of the daughters he considered his own, his partner through career changes, health scares, the deaths of parents, the births of grandchildren. "There was a lot of good, Eleanor," he said finally. "That was never the question." When they parted outside the cafe, there was a moment of awkwardness, the habit of 4 decades suggesting a goodbye kiss, reality asserting otherwise. Instead, they exchanged a brief hug, the curve of her pregnancy a tangible reminder of why they were now strangers. "Take care of yourself," Harold said, stepping back. "You too." Eleanor smiled sadly. "Goodbye, Harold." He watched her walk to her car, this woman he'd once known better than himself. As she drove away, Harold felt something shift inside him. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of peace. Some chapters were meant to end, even those you once believed would last forever. The story continued, just differently than he'd planned. Spring arrived with determined cheerfulness, coaxing green shoots from Harold's modest balcony planters. He'd never considered himself a gardener, that had been Eleanor's domain, but the small herb garden had become a quiet pleasure over the past months. Rosemary, thyme, and basil thrived under his careful attention, a small triumph that satisfied something deep within him. It had been 1 year since he'd stared at a calendar and felt his world collapse. Sometimes it seemed impossible that merely 12 months separated that life from this one. Other times it felt like decades. "You sure you don't want company today?" Mike asked over their regular Saturday morning phone call. "Janice is making her famous lasagna." "Thanks, but I'm good," Harold replied, meaning it. "Got plans already." After hanging up, he surveyed his apartment with quiet satisfaction. The space had fully transformed into his home, not just a temporary refuge, but a place that reflected who he was now. Woodworking projects filled the corners, a bookshelf, a coffee table, a jewelry box for Jennifer's upcoming birthday. His hands, always skilled with tools, had found purpose in creating rather than merely fixing. Harold showered and dressed carefully, choosing the blue shirt Melissa had given him for Christmas. "Brings out your eyes, Dad," she'd said. The grandkids were coming for dinner tomorrow, a weekly tradition now. He'd built a small train set that occupied one corner of the living room, much to 6-year-old Tommy's delight. The drive to the lakeside park took 30 minutes. Harold rolled down the windows, enjoying the spring air against his face. A year ago, he couldn't have imagined feeling this sense of peace again. The senior center occupied a renovated boathouse overlooking the water. Harold had resisted Jennifer's suggestion for months. "I'm not that old," he'd protested, but finally relented when she showed him their woodworking program. Now, every Saturday, he taught basic carpentry to a growing group of enthusiastic retirees. "Harold, right on time," called Marguerite, the program coordinator. A vibrant woman in her late 60s, she'd become a friend over the past few months. "The group's already setting up. And that new woman I mentioned is here, the one interested in learning how to build birdhouses." The workshop proceeded as usual, the satisfying rhythm of instruction, the pride in watching uncertain hands grow confident with tools. Harold moved among the tables, offering guidance, sharing the knowledge accumulated over decades of working with his hands. "Am I doing this right?" asked a voice behind him. Harold turned to find a woman with silver-streaked auburn hair holding a sander. Her technique needed adjustment, but her eyes, bright green and slightly mischievous, caught him off guard. "Almost," he said, recovering. "Mind if I show you?" "Please do," she replied. "I'm Ruth, by the way, new to the group and completely clueless about woodworking." Harold, and everyone starts somewhere. He guided her hands into the proper position, explaining the grain direction. Her quick laugh when the sander jerked unexpectedly was warm and unself-conscious. "My husband was the handy one," she explained as they worked. "After he passed 3 years ago, I realized I didn't know how to fix anything in the house. Thought it was time to learn." "Smart decision," Harold nodded. "Independence is important." "That's what my daughter says. She's the one who signed me up for this class." Ruth smiled. "What about you? You've obviously been doing this a long time." "All my life," Harold confirmed. "Used to be a mechanic, but woodworking was always my hobby. Now it's become something more." The class ended too quickly. As people packed up their projects, Ruth lingered, admiring the birdhouse taking shape under her novice efforts. "Will you be here next Saturday?" she asked. "Every week," Harold confirmed. "Still have a lot to teach you about birdhouses." Her smile brightened her entire face. "I'll be here." Later, at home on his balcony, Harold watched the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. A mug of coffee steamed beside him, and the scent of basil rose from the plants he'd tenderly cultivated. His phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. "Tommy can't stop talking about the train set. Be prepared to run it all evening tomorrow." Harold smiled, typing back, looking forward to it. A year ago, he'd believed his life was ending. The betrayal had seemed like a period at the end of a sentence, final, definitive, closing the book on everything that mattered. Instead, it had become a semicolon. What came before still mattered, still shaped him, but something new had begun. He thought briefly of Eleanor and the baby, now 6 months old. Melissa mentioned them occasionally, careful not to push the subject. The pain had dulled to a distant ache. Present, but no longer defining. Perhaps someday he'd meet Daniel. Perhaps not. That decision belonged to a future Harold he was still becoming. For now, this moment was enough. The herbs he'd planted were thriving. The grandchildren were coming tomorrow. A birdhouse stood half-finished in his workshop, waiting for next Saturday. and Ruth's green eyes had sparked something he'd thought long extinguished. Not romance, necessarily, but possibility. Harold sipped his coffee, watching the last rays of sunlight gild the horizon. At 63, he had discovered an unexpected truth. Endings, however painful, created space for beginnings. And beginnings, at any age, held their own particular sweetness. Sitting on my balcony as the evening settles around me, I find myself in a moment of reflection. It's been exactly 1 year since I discovered that calendar discrepancy. 1 year since my 42-year marriage unraveled in a single afternoon. Sometimes I still wake up reaching for Eleanor, momentarily forgetting that my bed is now a different size in a different room in a life I never expected to lead. Folks often ask if I'm bitter. It's a fair question. When betrayal comes after 4 decades of shared breakfasts and tax returns and Christmas mornings, bitterness seems the natural response. Some days, I won't lie, it still rises like heartburn, sharp and sudden. But those moments grow fewer as weeks pass. What surprised me most wasn't the pain. I expected that. It was discovering my own resilience at 63. There's something about starting over when your hair is gray and your knees creak that reveals what you're truly made of. Each small victory, assembling furniture without help, learning to cook for one, finding the courage to join that woodworking class at the senior center, built something new within me. A quiet pride, a hard-earned dignity. The herbs on my balcony have taught me something, too. When I first planted them, hands that had rebuilt engines now carefully pressing seeds into soil. I wasn't sure they'd grow, yet they pushed through anyway, defying my doubt. Isn't that what we do when life uproots us? We find new soil and grow again, perhaps differently, but grow nonetheless. My relationship with Melissa and Jennifer might be the greatest gift from this difficult year. Without Eleanor between us, something shifted. Their weekly visits with my grandchildren have become anchors in my new life. Tommy's excitement over the train set I built him. Little Sarah asking me to fix her toy cars because Grandpa knows engines. These moments remind me that family transcends the legal dissolution of marriage. I still wear my wedding ring, not on my finger anymore, but on a chain around my neck. Some might see this as inability to let go, but I view it differently. Those 42 years happened. They shaped me, brought 2 wonderful stepdaughters into my life, created the foundation for the grandchildren I adore. The betrayal doesn't erase the good parts, though for a while I thought it might. As for Eleanor, we've spoken twice. Brief, civil conversations, when she brought the grandkids once when Melissa was ill, and at Jennifer's promotion celebration last month. The baby, Daniel, is crawling now. He has Silas's eyes, Melissa mentioned casually, watching for my reaction. I simply nodded. Some wounds heal clean, others leave scars that occasionally ache when the weather changes. Ruth from the woodworking class invited me for coffee next week. Not a date, she emphasized, just 2 people who enjoy each other's company. I accepted. At our age, friendship is precious enough without complicating it by naming it something else too quickly. Still, I found myself selecting my best flannel shirt when I marked it on my calendar. That's the unexpected grace of this chapter. Discovering life continues to offer new possibilities, even after devastating endings. The heart, it seems, is like those herbs on my balcony. Given time and care, it finds a way to grow again, perhaps producing something different than before, but no less valuable. So if you're standing where I stood a year ago, staring at evidence of betrayal with tears blurring your vision, know this: the pain is real and deep and justified. But it isn't the end of your story, just the difficult middle of a chapter you didn't choose, but must navigate nonetheless. And on the other side, you might be surprised by what awaits. Not the life you planned, certainly, but one worth living with unexpected sweetness of its own.